you're going to have to fire him. That's what my CRO told me about the person on my team who was doing pretty well, but started to drop in his performance. And the problem was that as soon as his performance slipped, the other things that people didn't like about him became too obvious. Immediately, my reaction was, something's off about this. I know that this person is able to do more. I could take the route and fire him today, go replace him with somebody else, or I could do the other work, the harder work, and actually go figure out what's going on with this person. The next day, we had a one-on-one that was supposed to be 30 minutes long, and we spent 2.5 hours talking to each other. And during that time, everything was laid out on the table. There were moments where we were both getting very emotional, and I learned about this person's past, his limiting beliefs, and what ultimately led him to behaving in a way that was not in line with how the rest of the company viewed their culture. As a lone wolf, he was alienating everyone around him. And as soon as his performance dropped, that became too obvious. Sure enough, we go home and come back the next day, and it seemed like he had a new kind of energy about him, a new kind of flair. A day turned into a week, turned into a month, and by the end of that quarter, he was the top rep on my team as an SDR. The next quarter, he was again top SDR, most pipeline produced, crushed his quota. Sure enough, quarter after that, he was promoted into an account executive role where he stayed until he found his next role and moved on. And really, the story here comes back to a few core lessons that I learned throughout my time as a leader. The side of sales development that people don't talk about enough, because it's easy to talk about AI, it's easy to talk about email and hard skills. I can tell you about cold calling, cold email, social outreach, social selling, but the truth is the difference between the teams and the companies that have high performers consistently and the teams that don't has nothing to do with product market fit and has everything to do with your ability as a leader to have compassion and empathy. And I'm going to talk to you about specific scientifically proven skills that have been well established and studied in the world of organizational industrial psych. Now, the first one I want to tell you about is called psychological safety. The brief background on this is that it comes out of Google. And not only did it come out of Google, there was a project they called it Project Aristotle, where what Google wanted to know in the early 2000s was, why do some of our teams seem to consistently be top performing teams regardless of what project they're working on? And can we actually isolate what variables are contributing to that? It took them multiple years and tons of money, millions of dollars, to be able to investigate this. After years of doing the work, the team on it was about to give up hope because they could not figure it out. They couldn't understand what it was. They looked at hundreds of variables: IQ, background, age, gender, all sorts of things you can imagine, every variable possible. But instead of giving up, they went ahead and continued to dig deeper, and sure enough, they found the answer. This has later been identified as what we today call psychological safety. Psychological safety is essentially what it means when we feel safe to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, to disagree, to openly create concerns and create conflict, because it is okay if I do so. It's not reprimanded. I'm not punished for doing so. Essentially, psychological safety means there is no negative repercussion or pressure to sugarcoat bad news. It's fascinating because Amy Edmonton later came up with a ton of research built on top of this, talking about failure, smart failure versus unintelligent failure. But at the base of being able to experiment and grow is going to be psychological safety, because on top of that, you can innovate. Now, in a world where sales development is changing rapidly because of the tech landscape, this has got to be the number one thing. The number one thing that every single sales development and sales leader has to be focused on. Now, the second thing that can be built on top of psychological safety comes from one of my all-time favorites, Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Not surprisingly, also a Google alum. And in Radical Candor, Kim Scott proposes that there's 4 types of communication style. And it's a quadrant. There's ruinous empathy, manipulative insincerity, obnoxious aggression, and radical candor. I'll start with the worst. The worst of all of it is manipulative insincerity. That is essentially the person who is saying, I'm just going to get what I want out of you and I don't care. The second one is built on top of psychological safety. And this one is one of my all-time favorites. It has the cornerstone of my leadership style that has led to any kind of success I've been able to achieve and see firsthand, and that is radical candor. The book was written by Kim Scott, but it's not a new concept. We've seen it come up in the past, crucial or critical conversation. It's that idea that there are two directions in communication. There's caring personally, and there's challenging directly. Now, Kim proposes 4-part quadrant here, where on the lowest end, where you do not care and you do not challenge, is manipulative insincerity. It's a person who simply doesn't care and simply will not be direct or clear about what they want. Now, if you move along challenging directly, you actually get something that I've seen a lot, and you might see a lot too, which is obnoxious aggression. I think that we are privy to this in the sales world because of the pressure that we experience in sales to have to hit a time-bound artificial timeline, a quota. And suddenly that creates this pressure where leaders in sales will suddenly come down aggressively, very clear, challenging directly, but not caring very much, or at least displaying that it's not safe. Now, Kim actually surprisingly says that this is fairly effective, but it does not lead to long-term success, and it will become toxic, and it will erode psychological safety. Effective, but only in the short term. Now, the next one, if you go up, care personally, but away from challenging directly, is something that I personally have been guilty of in the past, called ruinous empathy. It's when you care too much to actually say what you need to say directly. And lastly is the most powerful form of communication, where you say what you need to say clearly without mincing words, but it comes from a place of care. That Kim calls radical candor. And this is a superpower for any leader. Now, the third thing is more of a mindset, and it's one that I actually framed a sign and put it in front of my desk. Now, the sign was 2 words, learned helplessness, and it had a giant X through it. And I framed it and put it above my desk because what would happen is I would have people come up to me asking me questions that honestly you could Google and get the answer to faster than it took to walk over to me. And I would make it very clear, but from a place of care, that I believe in personal growth and accountability, that you can take care of yourself. You can come up with the answers. The opposite of this is called learned optimism. Now, learned optimism is a phenomenon where people believe they are capable to change their circumstances. And after repeatedly experiencing any kind of failure or any kind of success, they continue to believe that they are capable of changing their circumstances. Now, this is a very powerful mindset if we're in sales, because here's one suggestion, one way that it shows up. If I am starting to see that my connect rate on my calls is dropping, my emails are not being responded to, my social DMs are not being answered, if it's moving down and I keep doing what I'm doing, I am essentially saying I don't control anything. I just hope it's going to work. But here's an opportunity. If I have this deep belief that I am capable of changing the circumstances, then I have learned optimism. I can make changes happen. This is one of the most sought after character traits that I look for when I'm doing interviewing, when I'm trying to hire new SDRs or sales reps. Now, the fourth and maybe most important for continuous growth of any team is one of my favorites called emotional contagion. Now, this is more of a broader concept, but I apply it to these principles. Emotional contagion is a form of social contagion that involves the spontaneous spread of emotions and any related behavior. We've all experienced it. If someone walks into a meeting grumpy, you could just see the cloud over their head. Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, just everything is terrible. I start to feel that. Now, there's been some very interesting hypotheses that have suggested that there's actually a neurochemical interaction that happens when we become physically close, but the more simple one is mirror neurons, something that's been well established and well studied, that our brains, because we're social beings, we essentially will mirror the people around us. This is why it is critical that every person is an A player, and an A player is defined by the person who has the right character traits, not the right IQ. It's the right attitude, not the right aptitude, because it's attitude, not aptitude, that will determine your altitude. One of my all-time favorite Zig Ziglar quotes. And what that means to me is your attitude can overcome all challenges, but your skills, your knowledge, your IQ is limited to where it is today. And we know from Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck that essentially growth mindset is a belief that I can change. I am not who I am today. I'm not stuck with my current set of skills. But it is not ignoring the fact that my set of skills might be limited today. And so emotional contagion is essentially the undercurrent behind what happens when you put people together on a team. And if you want a team of high performers, each individual is part of that equation, and how they show up every day is part of the equation. But as a leader, this is your greatest leverage and strength, because emotions can be shared across individuals in many ways, implicitly and explicitly. And as a leader, it is your job to stand up and show people what kind of excitement, enthusiasm, attitude is how you feel, and that contagion will spread. Spread the virus, spread the contagion.